Hello and welcome to topic 5. And in this topic, we're going to learn about criminal law. And in this lecture, we're going to be learning about the categories of law. So, what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, first, we're going to talk about the different categories of law, including the difference between criminal and civil law. And then we're going to talk about how crimes are classified. In particular, we're going to look at the difference between what a felony and a misdemeanor is. So, let's go ahead and get started. So, as the textbook points out, in modern America, law governs nearly every aspect of our lives. And that's true if you just, a lot of times the impact that laws have on our life kind of go, we don't really think about that, but let's just think about what you might have done today, right? And think about what your daily activities were. Let's say that you're taking classes not just online, but face to face. So let's say that you got in your car and you drove to campus. Well, right there, government's impacting your lives. That the roads that you drove on are either drivable or not drivable due to the government's maintaining of those roads and infrastructure. The amount of gas and the cost of your gas is a reflection of trade treaties that we might have with other countries, and whether or not that the gasoline and our fuel is the amount we pay for that in terms of trade with other countries. You pay a tax on your gasoline, and then when you get to campus and you come in, that you're in a building that's owned, if you are at one of the branch campuses, by the county. Your tuition, in fact, is offset by taxpayer dollars, etc. Okay, and so there's a lot of ways that even in small little portions of our lives that the law has a pretty profound impact on the way that we conduct ourselves. And so, law governs commerce and the economy, right? The cost of our gasoline, the kinds of products that you can buy in the grocery store, how much money you make in terms of like at least having a minimum income. All of those are examples of the ways that laws govern aspects of our lives. Laws control our private relationships. As you know from last week, you met my husband, wife, Mike. I'm married, and so our family life is governed by law. We're legally married, so the state recognizes our marriage, and because of that, it confers certain benefits. Such as the benefits regarding tax or Social Security or what those might be. And heaven forbid, if Mike and I ever got a divorce, that would be a dispute between two married people, and you'd want to get divorced. And the government, and the law has an impact on how that dispute is settled. That if you have children, custody of the children, who got children, alimony payments, division of property. And laws control the relationships between the individual and the government, right? That we do not do certain things because the government has said that those behaviors are criminal. And if we engage in those prohibited behaviors, there's a consequence to pay. But those are just some examples. And so as that quote says at the very top, that certain others from President John F. Kennedy, that certain other societies may respect the rule of force. That is, that people arrange themselves or interact with their government or interact with others because they fear punishment or they fear coercion from the government or maybe coercion from others. But we respect the rule of law, right? That we have laws, and those laws have this profound impact on how our lives are organized. So we know that law is an important aspect of our lives. Let's look at the different categories of law that your textbook identifies. There are many categories, but we're going to take a look at 3. The first, and let's just put these all up. The first is criminal law. The second is civil law. And the third is public law. And now let's talk about each of these individually. Now, this is a class on criminal law, and what you're learning about throughout the course of the semester is you're learning about the body of rules that define crimes, set up punishments for those crimes, and mandate the procedures for carrying out the criminal justice process, okay? And so that's what criminal law is. It's basically laws that regulate our behavior, prohibit certain kinds of behavior, and then give punishments for engaging in behaviors that are criminalized or prohibited. Civil law is just simply all law that isn't criminal, okay? So if it's not dealing with criminal sanctions, then for the most part, it falls in the category of civil law. And civil law, we're going to talk about each of these categories in more detail in a moment. Civil law sets out rules outlining how to deal with disputes that arise between private individuals and organizations. Okay, so I used that example on the last slide about divorce. Okay, divorce and marriage is civil law, because civil law is about outlining how to deal with other people in a contract, and also dealing the laws that deal with disputes that arise between individuals, whether that's a dispute of dissolving a marriage or dispute over a contract between a tenant and a land, somebody owns property, a property owner, or disputes among individuals. An individual could sue a corporation, for example. All fall in that category of civil law. We'll talk more about it in more detail in a second. And then public law is the branch of law that deals with the government and its relationship with individuals and its relationship with other governments. We're not going to talk a lot about public law. Public law usually is what we talk about, sort of the administrative and regulatory capacity that government has, right? So public law deals with the regulations that government may place on people regarding like parking ordinances, zoning, taxation. But broadly, you can think about public law as also criminal law, and criminal law being sort of a subset of public law, because public law is also about this relationship between governments and individuals, okay? But mostly when we're talking about public law, we're talking about regulatory sorts of schemes. But we're mostly going to focus on criminal and civil law. So your textbook talks about how criminal law is divided into two branches. That one branch of criminal law is what is known as substantive criminal law, basically dealing with the substance of crime. And the substantive criminal law is the branch of law that defines what behavior is a crime and then sets out what that punishment is, sort of the substance of criminal law. And the other branch of criminal law is known as procedural criminal law. And as that name sort of suggests, the procedural criminal law deals with are the laws that set out the basic rules of practice in the criminal justice system. Okay, so due process, fair procedure, the procedures that the criminal justice system must follow when it is charging somebody with the crime, trying somebody for a crime, and then the procedure that's followed, in relationship to the punishment, right? All of those steps that we talked about in the criminal justice process fall in the procedural criminal law. So let's take a look at different examples, and you tell me whether or not these examples fall in the category of substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law. All right, so let's test your knowledge of the difference between substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law. So the first one is classifying aggravated assault as a felony. And as we're going to learn in a little bit, if a crime is classified as a felony, that it's deemed a serious crime, and it usually comes with a more serious penalty. So does that deal with the substance of criminal law or the procedure of criminal law? Well, the correct answer is substantive, okay? Because it is classifying a particular crime as a bad crime, a felony with a harsher punishment. The second one is a person found guilty by a jury has a right to one appeal, okay? Is that having to do with the substance of criminal law or the procedure of the criminal justice system? The answer is procedure, right? It's procedural criminal law because it's telling us the process. If you're found guilty, the process is that you can appeal your guilty conviction. All persons charged with a crime that could result in incarceration have a right to counsel, have a right to an attorney. Is that about process or substance? It is process, procedural criminal law, because it's telling us if you're charged with a crime, there's a process that needs to be followed, that you have a right to counsel, and if you can't afford a counsel, one will be provided to you by the state. How about the punishment for auto theft is between 20 and 36 months? Procedural or substantive? Substantive, because it's the substance. It's telling us about what the punishment is for a crime that you committed. How about this one? A person failed to pay rent for 3 months and they're being evicted. Is that substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law, or neither, or both? It's kind of a trick question, but it serves as a segue into our next slide. If a person fails to pay their rent and is being evicted, they have not committed a crime. It's not a crime to not pay your rent. That is an example not of criminal law, but civil law. In particular, contract law, right? That you have a contract between one individual and another, and then a dispute might be settled if somebody fails to live up to their end of the bargain. So the last one is not criminal law, it's civil law. So let's take a look at what is civil law. So as mentioned before, civil law is defined as a set of rules outlining how to deal with disputes that arise between private individuals or disputes between private individuals and organizations or between organizations. Civil law also has to do with a failure to carry out a legal duty, okay? So let's take a look at different examples of civil law. So what are some types of civil disputes? Well, one type, and a very common one, is a breach of contract, okay? And so going with the example about paying a rent, okay, that when you are a renter, you sign a contract with the person who is the landlord, the person who owns the property. And you're basically, the contract, as you guys all know, sort of outlines that, this is how much the rent is, this is when it's due, these are your obligations as the tenant, maybe you have to shovel the sidewalk or take out the garbage or whatever. And then on the other hand, it tells us what the obligations of the landlord are, right? That if something breaks, they're going to fix it, that maybe they're the ones who shovel the drive, whatever. And so you sign that contract, and then a dispute would be if one of the two parties doesn't live up to its side of the contract. Either the rentee doesn't pay rent, or let's say the landlord doesn't, provide a particular service, and then you could sue that individual. The landlord could sue the rentee, or the rentee could sue the landlord for breach of contract, okay? And so there's civil law is the law governing how that dispute is going to be settled. Another example is invasion of privacy. Now, invading somebody's privacy could also be a criminal offense, right? Like if you're a peeping Tom and you trespass on someone's property and you're looking through their window, right? I mean, that is criminally prohibited. But there's other kinds of invasion of privacy that are civilly litigated, right? Such as maybe a journalist using a telephotic lens to take a picture. You could sue that journalist for an invasion of privacy, depending on what the civil law states. Sometimes we hire people to manage our finances. And so let's say you have like a retirement portfolio and you hire somebody to manage that so that, they help you make good investment decisions. Oh, let's say that they fail to do that, right? Let's say that they, don't invest your money properly, or they are taking out too many fees, violating the contract in terms of the fees that they were going to take. Well, that would be a breach of fiduciary duty, right? That individual you hired to manage and protect your property or money fails to do that, okay? You could sue that individual. Negligence, failure to exercise care. And so this would be an example of, sort of like on the previous slide where we said that sometimes civil law is failure to act. So I might hire somebody to take care of my dog, walk them, feed them, right? Make sure that they have some companionship while I'm out of town. Well, I've hired that individual and let's say they fail to do it. Well, I could sue that person for negligence, okay? That person could also be, criminally responsible too, depending on what the laws are, right? If it was intentional harm to my animal, right? That's usually prohibited or prohibited behavior. It's usually a crime. We'll talk about the overlap between civil law and criminal law in a second. Defamation, so you could sue somebody for saying things about you that are untrue and designed to harm your character. All of those are the types of disputes that arise, where we would ask a court or a judge to settle that dispute. Now, when let's say that in civil law, the individual is not found to be guilty, but they're found to be responsible. Okay, and so that if there's a contract dispute between a rentee and a landlord, that one would sue the other, and then the court, sometimes a jury, would determine who is the responsible party. And then if the responsible party for breaching that contract. And so, if you are found to be the responsible party, there is no criminal sanction. You wouldn't be sentenced to jail, okay? But that you could be, the court may order you to pay the damages that are associated with your neglect or with your breach of the contract. They might say, hey, you know what, you need to complete the contract. So if you hired somebody to do landscaping and they failed to do landscaping, they might need to pay you some damages, but they also might be instructed by the court to actually make good on that contract, okay? And I know I already said this, but just that when you are found to be responsible, the responsible party for that dispute, right, that you caused the dispute, you're responsible for it, you're not going to go to jail, okay? There's no loss of life. There's no loss of rights such as voting rights. You're not going to be incarcerated, okay? So I just wanted to reinforce that because the civil resolution is quite different than the criminal sanction that comes with being found guilty. Okay, so you might be wondering, why are you learning about civil law? Because this is a class that primarily focuses on criminal law. Well, the reason is there are some times when civil law and criminal law overlap. And the most frequent way that it overlaps is when it has to do with personal injury. So as it says there that civil law is related to criminal law, in that civil law sometimes deals with, in part, personal injury, or what's known as civil tort law, okay? And so that sometimes you might injure somebody, injure a human, and that you would have committed a crime, assaulting them, punching them in the face. But if you're found to be the responsible party for injuring somebody, you can also be sued, okay? And so let's take a look at a good example that shows the overlap of personal injury, tort law, civil law, and on the other side, criminal law. Now, a person can be both charged with a crime and they can also be sued for personal injury. And keep in mind that that does not violate the Fifth Amendment's double jeopardy clause, okay? Basically, to paraphrase in the Fifth Amendment, it basically says that an individual cannot be charged twice for the same crime. That's what double jeopardy is. Well, in the case, if you are charged with the crime and sued for personal injury, you're not being charged twice for a crime. You're being charged once for homicide, let's say, and then you're being sued by the family that lost their loved one. Okay, so it doesn't violate the double jeopardy clause in the Fifth Amendment. I know you all are thinking, of course, a great example of this is the example of O.J. Simpson, right? And the criminal case, the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson. That's the criminal case. The state of California charged O.J. Simpson with first-degree intentional homicide, okay? And as we all know, that after the trial was done, the jury found that O.J. Simpson was not guilty as charged. He was acquitted of that crime. However, and keep in mind, and in a second, we're going to talk about the kind of comparing criminal and civil law, okay? Keep in mind that the burden of proof, the evidentiary standard that the state needed to prove beyond a reason, is that they needed to prove that O.J. Simpson was guilty of first-degree intentional homicide beyond a reasonable doubt, okay? And so the standard, the burden of proof, the evidentiary standard is much higher in a criminal trial than it is in a civil trial, as we'll see in a moment. Now, there was also a civil case that the family of the parents of Nicole Brown Simpson brought against O.J. Simpson. And they sued him for wrongful death, okay? That he engaged in a wrongful death of Nicole Brown Simpson. And he was found to be the responsible party for that wrongful death. and that there's a lower standard that is used. That when it comes to a civil suit, the family and the lawyers of the family had to say that when you look at all of the evidence, that when you take the preponderance of the evidence suggests that O.J. Simpson was responsible for the wrongful death. And so the evidentiary standard is lower. And it makes sense because but when you're found guilty of a crime, the penalty can be very significant. In the case of O.J. Simpson, California has the death penalty. You could have been subject to the death penalty. Okay. And so you want to have a higher burden of proof. That the sanction for the civil case, he was found to be civilly responsible, that he had to pay the family for the damages that they experienced by losing their child. And so that he's going to lose money, and he had to sell his memorabilia and stuff like that, right? And in order to offset or to pay for those damages, which I don't think he ever fully paid. But since you're just losing money, that the burden of proof is lower there. Okay, so this is a good example of that overlapping of criminal law and civil law. So make sure that you look at the table that is in your textbook that shows the comparison in what ways criminal and tort law are similar and in what ways that they are different. Okay. And that you could see that some of the similarities is there are sanctions that are imposed, but the kinds of sanctions are different, right? One is the loss of liberty, the other is monetary for the most part. You can also see that here that some acts, including rape, assault, and battery, larceny, and corporate crimes, can be the basis for both criminal and civil action. Okay. And then, in criminal law, the monetary damages, the fines go to the state, and then the state divvies those out. In civil law, the individual receives damage as compensation for the harm done. And so it's one individual or one corporation paying another individual. Okay. Okay, so let's apply what we've learned. And so let me give you some examples, and then you can say, do you think this is primarily a civil matter, a criminal matter, or both, or neither? Marriage and divorce, is that primarily civil or criminal? Well, primarily, as we talked earlier, that marriage and divorce is a civil matter. Marriage is a contract between two people, and that dissolving that contract through divorce, that is a civil settling of a dispute. Copyright violation. So let's say you write a song and somebody steals your song. Is that criminal or is that civil? Well, it can be both, right? That if you could sue somebody for intellectual property rights, that they took something that was yours and they used it and made money off of it, right? So you could sue them for that. But also there are federal laws against copyright infringement, right? And so you could be charged with a violation of federal law. A car accident, civil, criminal, both, neither. It kind of depends on the situation, okay? And so you could definitely sue somebody for personal injury, right, if they bash into your car. But if you bash into somebody's car and you're engaged in a car accident because you're drunk driving or because you're engaging in highly negligent behavior, then you could be charged by the state with a crime. Identity theft, both sort of similar to copyright violation. So identity theft is a violation of privacy, but identity theft is also a criminal offense. Let's say you're denied unemployment. So let's say you get fired from your job and then you apply for unemployment benefits for the state of Wisconsin and you're denied those benefits. Has the state of Wisconsin engaged in a crime? Well, if you're denied unemployment benefits, it's a civil offense, okay? Or a civil matter. That you could say that you were wrongly denied your benefits, and therefore you could sue the state of Wisconsin for what you see as being a wrongful denial of those benefits, and then that dispute would be settled in court. However, if you lie about unemployment benefits, right? If you say you got fired and you didn't, or you said there's probably a criminal penalty that would be associated with that, but primarily civil. How about if a confession is beaten out of a person in police custody? So let's say a police beat you to get a confession out or just beat you and you die, right? Is that civil, criminal? It's both. Okay. So, I mean, you definitely see with the case of George Floyd, died in police custody, excessive use of force. And as we all know, Derek Chauvin was, charged and tried and convicted for his act. But the George Floyd family can also sue Derek Chauvin or the police department. They can sue the Minneapolis Police Department as well. And so hopefully that you did well on that in terms of applying those concepts. Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about is classifying crimes. And so each jurisdiction is responsible for defining and grading offenses. Classifying if you engage in this behavior and it's a criminal behavior, classifying how serious that crime is. And then the classification is oftentimes corresponds with the punishment that you're going to receive. Okay. And so the main classifications, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, are felony and misdemeanor. Okay. As you know, felonies, and we know this from the criminal justice wedding cake we learned about earlier, felonies are considered more serious crimes such as criminal homicide, robbery, a rape, aggravated assault, and that the punishment, because it's a felony, is more severe, that it could be punishable by death, and it could also result in a long-term incarceration. And if it's a long-term incarceration, you're going to be incarcerated in a state penitentiary or a federal penitentiary. Misdemeanor is a more minor offense. It's simple assault, petty theft, possession of marijuana, and that usually because it's seen as less egregious, less dangerous, less serious, the punishment is going to be less too. So you're a lot more likely to get probation if you commit a misdemeanor. And if you are incarcerated, you're going to be incarcerated for a shorter period of time in a non-state facility, usually a county jail. Okay. But keep in mind, each state is responsible for classifying whether a crime is a felony or a misdemeanor. There's usually uniformity between states, but not always. So you could commit an act in one state and would be considered a felony, but it might be considered a misdemeanor in another state. And then the federal government is also responsible for those classifications as well. Okay, that's it for this lecture. In lecture 2, we're going to take a look at the other aspect of criminal law, which is the elements of the crime. Talk to you soon.